Thank you, David, for excellent feedback and comments. Next, we have Dr. Michael Morris, lead agricultural economist from the World Bank. Michael also spent a year at IFPRI some point, sabbatical. Michael.
Thank you, Suresh, and good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this. As somebody who spends now quite a bit of my time thinking about policy reforms, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think David was asked to discuss from the perspective of nutrition, and me maybe from the perspective of the input subsidies. You didn't talk too much about nutrition. I'm not going to talk very much about input subsidies. I'm going to focus a little bit on the model itself and really make some remarks from the perspective of a practitioner and who's asking the question, how can the insights from this model help me in terms of making better decisions and be more influential going forward? I echo the remarks of David in congratulating the team for putting together, a model that's really intuitively very nice. It sort of it hits all the important areas that we think about. It's very logically organized. The one thing I really like about it is the way the key variables are grouped according to the stage of the policy reform process. So not only is there a nice set of checklists to sort of run through, but they're grouped in ways that really make a lot of sense. At what point of the process do you need to worry about certain things? I also really like, I think one really important feature of the model is this emphasis on veto players and persuasive advocates. In the real world, I think those are elements of this process that can be really, really critical and that we need to focus attention on. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And sometimes it's a tricky business because you're not always aware who those people are. They may be working behind the scenes, so it may be also very difficult to actually reach them and change their thinking. Now, a couple maybe sort of aspects of the model that make it a little bit less useful. I think the emphasis on veto players and persuasive advocates draws attention to the fact that the 16 variables are not necessarily of equal importance. And that's been made very clear by everybody. It's sort of a maximum set of things to consider. But when you think about trying to influence a policy process, and I'm really focusing on the forward-looking part, right? Not so much on the backward-looking part that Steve referred to. It's really difficult to know which of the 16 necessarily is going to be important. And if one of them can effectively trump all the others, that really limits the predictive value of the model. I think we all know cases, we can all think of cases in the real world where one really influential player has pushed through reforms despite tons of evidence that it's not a good idea from a cost-benefit perspective, that it's going to have adverse distributional impacts in terms of the poor, that the implementation capacity may not be there to actually deliver on the reforms, that the budget may be lacking. And so if one key veto player or key advocate can sort of trump all the others, that makes me a little bit nervous in terms of thinking about how can this be used in a prescriptive way. A second sort of maybe I'll call it a weakness of the model from applied point of view is that we read that, okay, we can go through these variables and identify cases depending on these testable hypotheses where policy reforms are likely to be effective. So that's where we should focus our attention. Well, I'm sorry to say, in the real world, we don't always have that luxury of saying, where do I think I'm going to be successful? A lot of times, the policy reforms come to us because they're the most critical ones to work on. And even when we know that some of those variables are not, some of those conditions are not being met, tough, we don't have a choice. We have to go to war anyway and try to make it happen. And so in that sense, one of the prescriptions in terms of trying to pick your fights, I mean, it's always wise to try to pick your fights, but in the real world, we don't always have that luxury. But does that mean the model is completely, without value? Not at all. I think one thing, as I was reflecting after reading it, at the beginning of the synthesis piece, particularly that I read in more detail, I have to admit I didn't study the longer paper to the last iota. There's something about it. There's a prefacing statement that says a lot of the policymakers, I'm trying to find the quote here, or a lot of the donors, they, let's see where, if I can find it. It says donor forays, which is a bit of a loaded word, I guess, into the policy formulation process typically have focused on a handful of standardized approaches for generating policy change, including policy conditionality, policy relevant empirical research, promotion of policy champions, and mutual accountability frameworks. I completely agree that that describes a lot of the things, at least in the World Bank, that we do when we're trying to influence policy reforms. But when you think about it, those things are very, very highly aligned with what this model is saying. Okay, policy relevant empirical research, right? It's designed to highlight the relevance of the problem, variable 3, provide knowledge and ideas, variable 4, influence norms, biases, ideology, and beliefs, variable 5, contribute to cost-benefit calculations. Promotion of policy champions, right, speaks directly to the mobilizing the powerful champions, variable 2, enlisting the support of government veto players and implementation stage veto players, variables 8 and 12, and ensuring the commitment of policy champions, variable 13. Conditionality that we engage in a lot in the bank is designed to provide or withhold budgets, requisite budgets, variable 10, or to make sure that the institutional capacity is there in place to actually deliver. So the things that we do actually are very, very highly aligned with this model. And I think that speaks to the fact that what goes on in the real world takes into account many of these processes. The big benefit, or to me, the new insights coming from this, is that we have them arrayed before us in a very logical way, aligned with the actual sequencing of policy reform processes. And it provides us with a way of going through a checklist, which probably we're doing anyway, many of us, but this just makes it much more explicit and in a way, I don't want to say cookbooky, but it definitely provides us with sort of a framework to think more logically about things that otherwise happen in a very intuitive way and sometimes in a somewhat haphazard way. So, thank you.